Then you hear him on a podcast actually talking about Japanese internment camps, how they were rounded up and arrested. Can we play that bite right here really quickly and just show you that he's actually comparing Japanese internment camps to January the 6th, and now he's calling his Democratic opponents enemies from within, which would, in his logic, would allow him to do the same thing, I think.
Why are they still being held? Nobody's ever been treated like this. Nobody's ever, maybe the Japanese during Second World War, frankly, but, you know, they were held too.
Why are they still being held? They beat up cops.
They committed crimes.
They committed crimes. They trashed the Capitol. They went into the Capitol. They tried to stop the constitutional counting of the vote, which is done every January 6th. They tried to get in the way at his insistence on the peaceful transfer of power. It's pretty obvious why. But anyway, so all of these lines are being drawn. And again, every day he talks about Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff being enemies from within. And every day that a Fox News host pushes back and says, you don't mean that, do you? And he says, yes, I mean that. He's done it now 3-4 times where he's pushed back.
Look, the comments are completely chilling and real. Fox News and other networks avoiding it and saying it's not what he means or not wanting to know what it means. Their lack of curiosity is bordering on malpractice and definitely not delivering truth or answers for their viewers.
Well, saying you don't know what he means is just not true. Let's bring in right now MSNBC chief legal correspondent and the host of MSNBC's The Beat, Ari Melber.
Yeah, and Ari, what's the legal possibilities given what Donald Trump has said and done and is expressing to do, if you know, to believe him?
Well, I think you're both hitting it on the head. The best predictor of behavior is behavior. And so this is what he tried to do in the first term. It's what he's admitting openly. And no number of Mike Johnson lies or Fox, we misheard you, you couldn't have meant that, aw shucks, will change the fact that he is saying this. I think Joe is exactly right to point to the negative precedents in American history and the dehumanizing legal loophole language. They also do this with foreign immigrants. Now, there are some people who are undocumented who have broken a law to be here, but we still currently have a legal process for that. If you go down the internment or the enemy combatant road, which he is publicly talking about because he's talked about a lot of different ways that he would abuse power, demanding executions, demanding attacks on the border of immigrants. As soon as you go down that road, as Joe emphasized, you are asking for that lane or legal loophole. And if you can do it to an enemy combatant or someone that you declare as an immigrant, first, that's wrong, and our system could show you examples of why that shouldn't happen. But second,
right.
If you're reelected and you say, I announced in public, this is what I get to do, it wasn't a secret. Once you open up that lane, Joe, then who's to say that you grab some other full American citizen and you put them in your, what they're calling an immigrant internment program? Where's your due process to even get out from under that? We had Stephen Miller, Trump White House aide on The Beat, and I asked him about what former Secretary Esper said about the controversial, likely illegal, and shocking demands that Miller was making, which were not carried out in the first term, to directly use the military on U.S. soil, which is banned by Posse Comitatus and other things. And I asked him about it, and Miller said on this air, within the last month, I don't see what's controversial about that. So you bet this is a big issue people need to understand, because they will date back to this campaign season, the enemy within and the other claims to say, everybody knew this if they get an electoral college victory. This was out there.
Well, yeah. You know, it's already what lawyers talk about, laying the precedent. He could very easily say, I said repeatedly that I was going to arrest Democrats. I said repeatedly that Democrats were the enemy from within. I said it repeatedly. And, you know, by the way, the Wall Street Journal editorial page yesterday wrote just a shocking op-ed where they talk about Trump derangement syndrome, basically, which is actually defined now, I guess, by quoting Donald Trump's own words. But they went after people like Anne Applebaum, who grew up fighting, pushing back against communism, who has spent her entire life documenting the
Autocracy,
dangers of the Soviet Union, the war crimes of the Soviet Union, the crimes against humanity, and this is being painted as some left-wing person. I want you to clear up one more thing here. I think it's very important. It's critical. There are people that I respect who will say, well, you know, Trump's already been in office for years, and nothing bad happened. They ignore January 6th, which the Wall Street Journal editorial page did too. And then they'll go, he never arrested Hillary Clinton. Well, I would like you to explain how he went to Jeff Sessions, his first attorney general, and said, I want you to arrest Hillary Clinton. Sessions came back and said, I've got nothing. We've got nothing we can arrest her on. And then he did the same thing to Barr. He tried in 17 and 18 to arrest Hillary Clinton. And then 2 weeks before the election, he started publicly pressuring Barr and privately pressuring Barr, his attorney general, to arrest Joe Biden and his family 2 weeks before an election.
Correct. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, and I've also heard that, Joe. I think, I don't know if we're talking to the same people or people who are just talking to each other on some, I don't know, tax cut group chat. But the evidence is there. And so we've heard people minimize or run away from it, and some people might be less informed. But the fact that they failed at certain things, they failed at the coup. Many people are convicted in prison on sedition and other charges who had due process, shredding the lies that Trump said on that podcast as if they were rounded up. No, they weren't. They had all their due process. The court appeals. Some of those cases, separately from his own, went to the Supreme Court. But they're convicted on sedition charges because they tried and failed to have a coup. Donald Trump tried and failed to get a foreign investigation of the Bidens. We had a whole impeachment over that. Now, had he succeeded, had that come out in a different order, and there had been a big, serious-sounding foreign investigation of Hunter Biden and Joe Biden before the Democratic primaries, if it was timed right, that might have been the thing that shifted it the other way. And what was Donald Trump worried about? The thing that happened. He correctly identified one thing, which is that Joe Biden was the bigger challenge to him in 2020. He lost that election. He tried to get McCabe investigated and indicted. They made 2 rounds at that, the deputy FBI director who replaced Comey. He failed. He got a tax audit into James Comey. He requested the Hillary Clinton investigation you mentioned. He had a trumped-up investigation of John Kerry, who many people may not thought about recently as a Democratic foe, but of course he was a Democratic nominee and Secretary of State. Those are just some. If we had more time, we could make a longer list. The fact that he failed.
And by the way, what about Durham? What about Durham as well? I mean, Durham made an absolute fool of himself going on what Donald Trump would call a witch hunt.
Absolutely. And talk about journalists. He's publicly threatened to pull licenses. He's gone after Bezos and other very powerful people just because they're affiliated with one newspaper. I mean, Jeff Bezos owns a lot of different stuff, but it's the newspaper, the one independent authority of fact checking that so upset Donald Trump. He went after CNN's merger for that reason. They happen to be a competitor here, but I'm talking about them as other credentialed journalists facing that kind of crackdown. That was last time. And the first Comey memo, this is often forgotten because there's such a pile of malfeasance. The first Comey memo detailed failed requests to investigate New York Times journalists, and Trump saying to Comey, with all the national security issues, if we could at least jail one, we could send a message. Well, Comey testified to Congress, and you remember, Joe and Mika, that was item 8 or 15, because there were other more serious ones. But that's in the early Comey memos, and whatever one thinks of James Comey now, he was a registered Republican who had a history in the Bush administration. He wrote that down because he was concerned about the illicit or possibly illegal targeting of the Times.
So, Ari, as a final note, the outsized role that Elon Musk is playing in this election, but in particular, this offer to pay people to register to vote. Can you talk to us about the legality of that?
Yeah, I'll be quick. Federal law already bans efforts to buy voter registration. Before you even get to whether he is also nudging towards Trump, which the topics in his so-called petition seem to do. So depending on how the courts view this, if they view it as an inducement to register, he says, oh, it's money for people who've already registered. But if people who haven't registered look at that as a bounty or reward and register for that reason, it could violate federal law. There haven't been precedents on this, so it is a larger question. And a final non-legal point. If it's October in a general election and the only way you can get people to agree with your ideas is to pay them, maybe your ideas aren't that popular.